Found Jay.
Ah, there we go. All right. All right. I believe we are good to start.
Are we live? Okay. Excellent. Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Gregory Wilson. I am moderating this panel, and I believe we have one other person who's going to be, in quotes, switched from attendee to panelist in a moment when we get that worked out on the tech, because Jay Smith is with us too. But I'm
Yes.
also here with Nathan Schell, and so I guess in time-honored tradition, welcome everybody, by the way, to Storytelling with New Technology panel. There's Jay. And welcome to the Storytelling with New Technology panel. Welcome everyone on a Sunday morning. And I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get cracking on this. And I'll start with Nathan.
All right. My name is Nathan Schell. I am an executive producer on Dark Operations Terminus, and I'm also a producer slash editor, researcher, what have you, for several podcasts. Studying Scarlet podcast, which is a true crime podcast. Never Gets Old podcast, which is a overall geekery and adult life with family or pets, what have you. And then a MacGyver podcast, which is heavily Richard Dean Anderson and his body of work centric.
Okay, awesome. Jay, welcome.
Hey, I'm Jay Smith. I'm a writer, a podcaster, and I produce audio drama. I created the Parsec award-winning HG World Zombie series a long time ago, and Hidden Harbor Mysteries. I've been involved in several podcasts over the years, and have used the pandemic to create a new audience that's I could read work directly to take their minds off the mind-numbing change of life that we've been going through the past 12 months.
Yep. Jay and I were on a panel yesterday about online civility, where this subject of mind numbing came up, and how we override these things. Well, as I said, my name is Gregory Wilson. I am a college professor and an author of speculative fiction. I tend to focus quite a bit, obviously, on story and narrative in my life. And the two social media things which are of importance to this particular panel is that I run or co-host a podcast called Speculate, which is now in its, I think, 11th year of production, which has morphed over the years from what started as kind of an interview show and a deep dive analysis of various techniques of storytelling and so forth, and novel writing and games, to an actual play podcast now with a number of different authors and people like Brandon O'Brien, who is now one of our co-hosts, and Michael Underwood, who's the other co-host now. So the three of us run various shows on that. And I also run, for now coming up on 9 years actually, a Twitch TV channel under the moniker Arvin Eleron, which focuses on story and narrative in games, and has a number of tabletop gameplay sessions and things like that with people like Kat Rambo and Carlos Hernandez and Amalo Matar and many other writers that you might know from the SFF community. And we run now something on the order of about 7 campaigns a month on my channel. Either me or other people, fortunately, are starting to do these too, because I'm tapped out in terms of how much time I am able to spend. But that's what we do on that regard. So this is about storytelling really in new mediums and using new technology. And you're right, Jay, to start us off with that idea about the effect the pandemic has had. I guess I want to start us off first with a question about the basics of what we imagine storytelling to be before we get to how we deliver it. And so I want to ask about the principles of storytelling for each of you, about the important things that you need to consider as you put together a story, and then have those principles changed or altered with the advent of new technology, whether it's podcasting or live streaming or any of these things that we'll have a chance to talk about, or have the principles changed, or simply the way those principles are delivered? And I guess we'll go in reverse order. We can start with Jay first. What you think the principles of storytelling are, and have they changed with the advent of new technology, and if so, how?
I started out writing literary fiction and moved to popular fiction as kind of I didn't want to be heady. I wanted to entertain people. I wanted to, the stuff that I wrote as a young man was very pretentious and overbearing, but I found more satisfaction in telling stories that people can relate to, creating characters and imagining where those characters, how to transform them from being a deeply problematic situation into something they can overcome. That's very individual stories. I grew up listening to radio drama, and I've always been fascinated by the ability to coax people to imagine their own story in their head. And I never, even growing up in the age of Star Wars, where everything was spectacle, storytelling to me is evoking an emotion and a reality inside the listener or the reader's head and taking them on a journey. I write vignettes that have no plot. It's just an experience. It's something that I hope the story, the tale, whatever I'm trying to tell in whatever medium, is evocative and stays with them. So it really depends. I mean, if I think about the literary fiction that I've read, in contemporary literary fiction, it's all about there's a complication of conflict and symbolism that doesn't translate to every medium, but popular fiction seems to be able to transcend that and be able to be applied to all media. I think in the last year, I keep hearing that more people are tuning into podcasts and audiobooks and other new media. It hasn't really changed me, because I've always been interested in creating a story and a conflict and trying to break that path, but then determining what medium is best suited to tell that story. I think in some ways, Star Wars can be converted to radio drama. It just has to be done well, and it has been. NPR had a great series of the original trilogy back in the day, but is it best told in that medium? I would say no. There are advantages to character development and dialogue and whatnot that it's enhanced in that medium, but Star Wars is still a spectacle. So I guess it doesn't really matter to me what the medium is. The medium will reveal itself to me once I've decided what the story is.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Nathan, what about you?
No, I think Jay really touched on it. Evoking an emotion, and that realistically has been what we've been trying to do with Dark Operations, evoking people's emotions with the overall plot that's dealing with. The TLDR version of it is, you have these people that the government, for lack of better wording, puts into harm's way, not to put them in harm's way, but to protect those people, the citizenry. And then what happens when the government deems the actions of these select few? What do they do when they feel they've gone too far? How do they get treated? It kind of touches on how we treated our soldiers when they came home from Vietnam, and how in some regards people were treated after the myriad of conflicts that we've been involved with since then. So with that, we have historical examples of things that we can pull from for inspiration, but also we want to do it in a way that's respectful to what's happened in reality. And we don't want to end up giving anybody unnecessary flashbacks per se, but we also want to do it in a way that Joe Schmo or Jane Doe down the street can get the feeling, that emotional connection to the characters. But with ours, it does benefit from a visual element. Now, would there be ways that we could do it through like a podcast or an audiobook? Absolutely. I have been trying to get our writer on board to do a novelization of it as well, because I think that would be immensely beneficial as well, because you can literally hand the reins visually to a writer just by the way you can describe things, set the mood through describing the scents, the smells, the just the air. I don't have the writing chops for that, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would take that on. But it's interesting. Storytelling in whatever format, most often than not, I think you can get the bones of what you're trying to tell. But as Jay said, there are some that just benefit. Like, I don't think I could ever imagine seeing, or sorry, not seeing, that's the wrong word, experiencing Star Wars solely through an audio format. Novelization, I've read several of the books and they're phenomenal, but I also have the benefit of having seen Star Wars. I've seen a lightsaber, I've seen an X-wing careen by. You have those visual elements to pull back from, but without them, I don't know if it would be the same experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. It ties into this idea that it's sort of the vessel in which you pour the water of the story. The principles maybe of the story are the same, but the way that you experience it varies wildly, depending obviously on the medium that you're receiving it, and that there's some things that are capable of only better being received in a particular format than the others. I remember the NPR audio of the Star Wars thing that you were talking about, Jay, and yeah, as someone who grew up seeing these things in the theater, it didn't that's a different kind of feel. Whereas on the other hand, I also grew up listening to NPR versions of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and that stuff. Obviously, I had read it first. That was my love as a kid, and then heard it. And then it wasn't until the late '90s, early 2000s that we actually got film versions. And Jackson did very well with those. But at that point, I think I had already had the ground set for me in a way that I could enjoy this new experience that I had because I didn't encounter it first in a visual field. So I guess that leads to a question then about, if given a choice, what are the sort of what are the sort of components for you about how you would prefer to tell a story? If you have an idea for something that you want to present, under what circumstances do you know, okay, this is something that I really want to do in an audio form, and in, let us say, a short audio form, in little things you might get from Escape Pod or Podcast or one of these types of things, right? Or something that is better for a longer form audio, or something which just isn't going to work in audio and I need to put together in some, actual written medium, or a particular interest of mine in game design, being able to put this stuff out in a tabletop game or in a video game or something like that. Do you have an idea about when as you're coming up with a particular concept in your head, this really ought to be like this, or is it just trial and error in terms of how you want to do something? And I guess I'll go in reverse order. I'll start with Nathan. Nathan, I know obviously you've been doing the specific podcast stuff, and I guess the question is that then always the go-to, or is there a moment in your mind where you're like, what, this would be better if I did this or farmed it out to someone who could do this in whatever the other form might be?
What are the other format? Well, I mean, that's a really good question. The way I go about it is I generally don't think of the presentation format until I've got an idea of how I can visualize the world. Like if I'm visualizing the world, the universe, or even just the scene, if I'm able to visualize it on my own with a solid description of it, I'll admit I cheat. I'll ask, my wife, although she can be a bit biased, or I'll ask, my friend Royce, or I'll ask 2 or 3 people that I trust their opinion. I value their candor, as it were, and I'll say, how well does this work for you? Can you visualize it, or does it need something? And then from there, I look at it and it's like, okay, 2 of the 3 people say, I can see it, but just it feels like it's missing something. Then I'll sit and look at it and be like, okay, is this something where it needs a audio, element. Like, with audiobooks, you can do a lot with just music. Like you'd mentioned earlier about tabletop gaming. I've been dealing with an online campaign with a couple friends of mine for D&D. And once the DM introduced music, it changed the entire landscape of the experience, because you have that element that's constant in the background. And when that music crescendos or starts to get low and somber, it really affects the tone of the scene. So music definitely can have an impact on it. So if I notice that ends up having an impact on what's going on, like what I'll do is I'll sit and I'll read, or I'll have somebody read it while I'm listening to music. And if that has an impact, okay, well then, is this something that would behoove the element or the benefit of going into an audio format? Or because I've got the music element, would it be a step farther, more beneficial to go with the visual element of like a little webisode or a short film or what have you?
Right.
So,
That makes a lot of sense. Jay, what about you?
My first interest was filmmaking when I was younger. So every story I felt had to fit into that mold, and I think if I had continued that, the best I could have hoped for was to be somewhat like Kevin Smith. My writing style is character driven, dialogue driven, which isn't really exciting from a visual standpoint. So I had to reprogram myself to think in different media. Like when I think of Kevin Smith movies, I think they could be radio plays. I think it's very Tom Stoppard in a way.
Sure. Yeah.
But for me, it's I will probably be halfway through a rough manuscript, just prose, and decide if this is something that would benefit from visual elements or sound element. Can I just tell this story with sound? And sometimes I'll go into a story in the voice of a character that I know a voice actor who is speaking to me in my head when I'm writing it. And that will take me from prose to radio drama, or maybe I will full cast instead of doing a full production, maybe do multiple voices. Um, I also think in terms of how can I involve other artists, because I think while my writing, I'm satisfied with that. Film and theater tend to draw me toward a collaborative creative effort. So I try to think in terms of, am I going to be the caretaker of this entire story? Am I going to have the voice and be in every part of this? Can I carry that out, or can I enhance this story by bringing in other talents to make it better than it could be if I use my flailing talents to write everything? I think with my work after Hidden Harbor Mysteries in audio drama, I didn't think of writing anything without specifically looking for a voice actor to read it. And so that has a big influence on me in terms of directing where it goes. I just have this weird, I want to work with this actor. So I want to write a story that would specifically draw that actor to read my words, because that's really cool. So I'm kind of weird in that way. I'm looking for different ways to tell stories. If I can tell them in multiple media, then I'm that's bonus. I think it's at the point where I know where the characters are going. I know what the story is, because when you start a story and you're writing something that's longer than a few hundred words, when you're trying to construct something that's novella length, your entire story can change halfway through, and you realize your initial intention was inferior to something you could do. And even at that point, you're thinking, wow, yeah, you know what? This is more of a musical. I could really work with this other guy and enhance the concepts by having him write songs. So again, that's kind of how my weird brain works. But I think there's no one point, but it will tell you when it's ready to know to expose where it's going to go.
Sure. Yeah. If you understand the core of the story in a way, it sort of will dictate how it's ultimately going to be told. That point that you made, I think, about collaboration that technology permits is interesting too, I think, because it's true that if we think about, the early days of getting people together in a place to do a thing, because doing stuff over phone or whatever was not, not optimal, and you didn't have the kind of technology that we're talking about now. There's been part of the reason, I think, for this enormous revolution in Dungeons and Dragons popularity is not just because you have the places, things like Critical Role and people watching this stuff on channels like Twitch and the huge explosion of popularity that way, but because of the possibility for connection. So you can have people from multiple continents and time zones. And I figured out the other day that our campaign, that the campaigns that we run have, I think, players from 12 different countries.
Oh, wow.
That is something which would not have been conceivable, right, at all, certainly growing up as I did in the 80s. And it would not have been conceivable even probably 10 years ago in the way that it is now, where, and with an audience too, you know, with a group of people who are watching in real time this story being constructed and are in some ways contributing to it. And I want to ask something about that as well. And I will just quickly, as a reminder, for those folks who came in and may not have heard my note about this, if any of the attendees have questions for us, please feel free to ask us using the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can add a comment in the chat as well, and we will try to address it as we can. But I also wanted to ask a little bit about the immediacy of response that some of these technologies permit, positively and negatively, in terms of your storytelling process. So if you produce a podcast, once it's out there in the ether, you could theoretically get a response as soon as it takes for somebody to listen to it, consume it, and then respond to you, which is something that those of us who have, you know, been in publishing for a long time, getting stuff published, that's not how it works, right? It's this panic, please get this to us. Okay, no, we'll be back to you in 2 years, maybe, if we remember you exist, right? And so there's a much more, if you're live streaming, obviously it's immediate, it's at the time things are happening. But even if you're producing YouTube videos for content or podcasts for content or any of those sorts of things, it's a much quicker response curve, a much, I guess, shorter response or smaller response curve. And I'm wondering, does that have an impact for you in the knowledge of how much more quickly your given story is going to be consumed? And does that affect the way that you produce a story? I'm sure the knee-jerk reaction is like, no, of course not. But I mean, you know, does it in fact make it a different experience for you, knowing that you're going to get feedback? Theoretically, you could get feedback much faster. And I'll start with Jay and then work back up to Nathan.
Yeah, it definitely does. When I started, it wasn't as many people doing podcasts, or certainly not audio drama. This is 2009, 2010. Certainly, it's more difficult to have your voice heard. But once you've established your footprint and people are starting to respond to you, certainly my HG World was influenced by listener response. I guess any television show, anything that's an ongoing production, is going to be influenced by listener or viewer response. Because if a character I create you're going to hate, I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to try and pull them so I can retain your listenership.
Okay.
In HG World, I had a character that was just a throw-off called Dogberry. He was basically Golem with a mountain man in the woods. He was basically supposed to show up, do something stupid, and walk off. I had such a reaction to that one character, mainly because of the actor, that I wrote an entire arc for him. So I'm not above pandering to my audience if they want something that I'd never intended. And certainly if I have a quote profound idea that I want to explore and I'm getting a flat line from people, I'm not going to follow that. So I consider, like I said, I consider myself more of an entertainer. I do want to tell my stories, but if I'm going to be telling it to 5 people for 10 years at a cost of X and the time of my actors, that doesn't seem to be a viable business option for me. And if the actors aren't enjoying it, then that's another consideration. When it comes to my work, I will typically, if I write a short story or a longer piece that's going to be read by an actor, that's on me. I will try and engineer it to be the most entertaining possible and put it out there. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, sorry. Hope you like the next one. But those are like the closed stories that I write. The horror fiction that I write is mine, and I put it out there. And it's my job to be judged as much as to be an entertainer. But I'm not going to change that based on, well, I didn't like your story. Your next story should be this. That's not how television, film, and radio drama work and ongoing. You're trying to build that audience in your market. Eventually, I hope I have enough people that they like my stories, my prose, in the same way that they kind of get what I would call a brand, my brand, whatever the hell that is, and they'll come back for the next story, whatever it is.
Yeah, at that point, they're with you, not just necessarily just the story that you're going to tell. Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like that at that point you've built up a devout fan base that, you know, they just enjoy your style of
Right.
going about storytelling.
Right. Nathan, what about you?
Well, for Dark Operations, that's kind of an odd one because we had done a film back in 2000, oh God, 2007, that the reaction we had gotten from viewers was less than stellar, but we had also been breaking certain molds. Like the captain is not a muscular, thin, youthful, you know, Chris Pine or Chris Evans or any of the Chris's. It was a bigger, more realistic person. As a matter of fact, my best friend Royce. And so, you know, certain things, you know, you have to evaluate as, okay, which do you value more, the viewership response or the story that you're trying to tell? That did have an impact on the quality of the story that we're currently trying to tell, which is the end of the story. We started with the beginning, we're jumping to the end. That way, the people who have been a part of the project can find closure to the story. Mostly, that's who we're doing that particular project for. But you know, there is talk of trying to fill in the gaps with stories and formats of podcast or audio drama, novelizations, if I can grease that squeaky wheel, or even somebody had suggested even doing like a video game or even graphic novel. So all valid forms of storytelling. It's just a matter of deciding which direction that wants to go. But as far as immediate responses to things, I actually have a story from the podcast that I edit and produced, Studying Scarlet. It was about, I want to say, 3 months in to us doing our podcast. And we drop the episodes at 1 o'clock Eastern time. That way, by the time people wake up, it can have already, you know, downloaded into their respective podcast apps or, you know, however they decide to listen. I'd gotten an email at, I think, around 7:30 that morning from somebody who had listened to an episode. And here, what happened was when I was editing it, there are certain things that, you know, the hosts will do. They'll be like, "Hey, Nate, edit this out. I'm going to start over." Well, when I had edited it, I'd taken everything out that they had said prior to, edit that out. So there's a random spot in the episode where Nate, edit that out, and it had no bearing to what had come before it because I had already pulled it out. So I'm freaking out, like, oh God, how am I going to fix this? You know, the two hosts are like, no, it's okay. You know, we play up the, you know, the goofy banter between the two of us. We could just pawn it off. And I'm like, yeah, but this just is like a glaring whoops, you know. So I went in, I uploaded the raw file because my digital footprint on my computer is like my office, chaotic order. So I went in, I pulled that element out because they were so nice enough to at least timestamp it. Oh yeah, it was at like 38 minutes and 28 seconds. So I'm like, okay, went in, found it, pulled that out, re-rendered the file, and I'm like, okay, well that's great for my end. I wonder if I can actually fix it and it just self-populate out into the ethers. Fortunately, the host that we use to upload the files to has this option. Override the file with a new file. So I clicked on that, put the new one up. And unless anybody had listened to it that day, they're oblivious to my oops. Unless they're watching this, unless they're into this panel right
Yeah, I
now.
was gonna say the secret's out now. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the nice things about that particular format. But yeah, with visual, like storytelling in a production like TV or film, or even I'm sure you guys have stories with writing, you know, once it's out there and it's out of a format that you can't have that safety net of going back and fixing an oops, you know, it would be it would be an unfathomable amount of stress, I would think.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, I think, the immediacy of it, um, which gets set against the relative permanence of something in more written form. There is a danger, I think, in story construction by focus group, you know, where people's reactions, I mean, Jay, your point about like a particular character that you like, you write more about, absolutely. But then there's also the danger, it seems to me, of producing something that people are kind of like, and then you become, I can imagine becoming almost hypersensitive to, I've got to, whoa, I got to immediately go to something else. And it can, especially if you're releasing something serially, it can break down the potential for an actual character arc. You think about a character that you get at the beginning of a story. How many times have we had the experience of a character that we don't particularly like or don't particularly find interesting, but if you stay with the character over the course of a longer form novel or something like that, which is more permanent, that character becomes deeply engaging precisely because we didn't really appreciate them all that much. We didn't really think there was a lot of value to them. I'm reading right now Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time to my daughter, and the character of Meg is a kind of, by her own admission, and so we know this because she's constantly telling us this, is kind of irritating at the beginning. She's constantly defiant and constantly frustrated with everybody and constantly, because she's an adolescent and she's growing up and this is the way things are. By the time we get to the end of that tale, it is precisely her defiance, right? She's told by Mrs. Whatsit, I give you your faults. That's your greatest gift. And it's her defiance that allows her to resist this oppression. And that's really one of the underlying meanings of that book, is about resistance to oppression through defiance, something which Meg herself viewed as a fault at the beginning. If you do that in a serial form and you're releasing it and you're immediately getting this sort of like, thumbs down emojis like all across the sort of list, there's got to be a huge downward pressure, it seems to me, to be like, we got to like move off this person entirely, which means you don't get that kind of sticking with a character for long enough to kind of marinate in what they are, right? And being able to recognize who they are. That is something, it seems to me, which potentially could get lost in the sort of new, quickly right now, technology. That and the fact that you really should not go back a decade later and try to revise your own work. I'm not going to name any authors we could think of who have done this. This is a bad idea. Okay, let the work stay as it is, please. I want to go to a couple of comments that we got actually in chat. One of them was from Robert is Teching for us, which is this idea about getting into Japanese light novels, and they are for the most part written as if they're animated in an anime, which is a telling of what would be on the screen, right? A lot of the sort of manga anime connection has been talked about before, basically doing the same kind of thing, but in written as opposed to on screen form. And that's also, I believe that's Triffid, who says, I listened to one actual play podcast that the GM narrates as though it's a movie. You see the camera pull back. And I think that's the other question that I want to throw to the panelists here is, does the influence of some of these new technologies, I talked about the question of whether it affects your storytelling principles. I'm also curious if it affects delivery for you. And I guess I'm thinking here a little bit about, is there a way in which thinking about what we know we can do with certain technologies now, are you responsive to that in the way that you're doing things in other formats? And I'll give you one for instance, and then I'll let you both, go off on that. One of the effects that in tabletop gaming Critical Role has had is that people now increasingly, if they're going to be live streaming their content, first of all, many of them are live streaming their content instead of just playing with friends, on Zoom or whatever while we have the pandemic or around a table. And then secondly, they feel, I think, a pressure or desire to produce what Critical Role does, which, to be clear, are a bunch of 7 prominent and privileged voice actors in California who are able to do things with each other because they've spent 20 years at their craft, right? This is a little different, including their dungeon master, Matt Mercer. So that everyone now wants to be Critical Role without really being the actors that are necessary to make something like Critical Role. And so I see that as something which has some positives, but often some detriments as well, in that people are not really playing to their strengths. They're playing to what they imagine this new technology has shown them something like D&D can be. So I want to ask if either of you have felt that sort of pressure, and if it's something you resist or something you kind of go with the flow and say, you know what, I want to be able to do something more cinematically, I guess, to springboard off an earlier topic, because I've seen the way that looks in, other forms of media that we're using. And I'll leave that for either one of you to take on first.
All right. Jay, do you want to go first?
Well, as you're talking, Greg, I was thinking when we created HG World, it was about the same time as Casey Whalen created a similar series called We're Alive. We're Alive is a tremendous show that Casey puts out. He does it live in a studio out in California. and despite the pandemic, he's still producing it under limited conditions. Throughout the production of our show, we were the GoBots to their Transformers. We were like the bar band to their Led Zeppelin. But there was always this pressure to be more like that show, not only in terms of quality and production, but in terms of theme, and try and poach more people from that audience. And it is. I mean, when you look at people who are doing things bigger and more successfully than yourself, you definitely want to learn from them. And there is an influence that, well, that many people like that, and people are sheep. So if I just replicate that, success. It's something that an artist, I think anyone who's ambitious to try and monetize or turn a profit or get some kind of gratification from it, an artist will have a tendency to try and ape what's been done before. That's natural. That's something that has to be weaned out of an artist to make a good artistic choice at the risk of not reaching an audience as big as they expect, or not making the money that they expect. And we also came out around the time The Walking Dead was huge, and zombies were a major thing. So my lesson from that was you're going to tell your story. You're trying to entertain the people that you have and have them go out and bring more people to you by telling your story. And back to my comment earlier, I want to keep people entertained so that they don't go back to We're Alive as their. If they have 30 minutes to listen to something, I would rather they listen to what I've produced in the car on their way to work. So I'm going to look to, I think in every story, I want to be Harlan Ellison. I want to be Hunter S. Thompson. But I think in artist's life, and there's a moment where you just realize that you're never going to be that, but you could be something better in yourself. That's the leap that a lot of artists don't take. They want to make sure it's safe so that they can justify it to their parents or their significant other that it's a worthwhile endeavor. I'll never write The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because that's been written. But hopefully I could do something similar and build off of that.
Yeah. Nathan, what about you?
I mean, that's a very great way of putting it, Jay. And it's funny you mentioned We're Alive. That's actually what sparked the idea for possibly pursuing audio, an audio drama format for, our production. Because at the time I was working a night job, and, when you're working by yourself and you have nothing to do but listen to music or listen to podcasts or what have you, granted, listen, now that I think about it, listening to a zombie based audio story in a grocery store where you're one of like two people, probably not the greatest idea, but but it's one of those that, it was very well produced. I actually didn't realize it was still going on, because once I left that job, I kind of lost track of it. So it tells me I've got some catching up to do, and obviously I definitely want to try to give yours a listen. But I do see that it can have an influence of, how you perceive storytelling, like ways of delivering it. I try to, I've often tried to look at things as, do I want to use this as an inspiration, or do I want to cookie cutter it? For me, I try to look at ways to get the inspiration from it, not, copy paste format. It's, to me, that seems kind of too repetitive, and unfortunately there are a lot of storytellers out there in the world that will see, oh, this person's successful in this format, they'll just cut and paste it without putting themselves into it, putting a little bit of their own personality, their own tastes, their wants into it. And I think that's where they end up kind of losing themselves in the whole process, because you have a fan base that will follow you from whatever form of storytelling to the next, because they appreciate you, you know. And if you're just copy pasting, like Grant had said, the critical role format, if you've copied critical and role format, well, what's saying the next person that comes along that is essentially doing the same thing but with a little bit of their own take on it, where they play up the fact that maybe they're a bunch of amateurs that don't necessarily know what they're doing, but the way they're doing it has that appeal. Well, then the audience that you poached from Critical Role is going to get poached from you because you didn't take that risk. You didn't put yourself into your project.
Mhm.
And I think that's, a mistake that unfortunately a lot of people make. But for me, I will freely admit I have screwed up a lot of times. There's probably hours worth of footage of me goofing up on Dark Operations, but my personality will show through because I've stayed true to myself while pulling those inspirations.
Yeah, it's an excellent point that having, we throw around the word authenticity, but really what we mean, I think, is people connecting to whatever we truly are. And they're not likely
Yes.
to stay with you. And they're just going to sort of slip off of you, if you'll follow the metaphor, if what you're showing them is kind of a paper cutout, if it never really was you to begin with. And I think that's difficult for an artist because you get to a certain point where you realize that the best kind of writing, the best kind of content production, whatever technology you're using, is about vulnerability. It's about personal, within reason, exposure, right? It's about what Kiz Johnson talks about, the fire of your art molded to the craft that allows you to execute that properly so that people can experience it as you experience it. And that's difficult for people, I think, because they see this sort of overwhelming impact of whatever the new hotness happens to be. And wow, look at what appealed. But what appealed was not the slickness of it. What appealed was whatever that thing was. And so, chasing that, it seems to me, is a fool's game. But it's difficult to get people to go down that road. Well, I think we have about, I'm guessing, about 10 minutes. So I will, again, invite anyone in the audience, if they have questions or comments, please put those there in chat/QA. But I do have one other thing I want to ask these gentlemen, which is about what we see on the horizon as to what is the next great frontier in terms of a particular medium or storytelling format that you find intriguing and engaging, something that is really looking like this is going to be neat, whether it's a version of what we already do, some kind of micro or macro version of audio production or something like that I'm not aware of, maybe, whether it's something that's really leaning into the new technologies. I hate to bring up VR because I feel like the last 20 years we've been told how VR is the great new frontier, and I remain skeptical because I've been hearing it for 20 years. It's like being told my whole life that metrics were coming to the US. No, we're going to, anytime now, we're going to have the metric system here. That is, I think people resist harder than people think they do in terms of, and their inertia is a big thing. But I'm curious as to whether there is a sense from either of you about it, something you're really excited about in terms of how to deliver particular story content that you're like, I can't wait to see this, when it becomes viable. And I'll start with Jay on this, I guess, and work up to Nathan.
I don't think it's really advanced tech, but it's new and immersive. The packaged mystery concept that's growing. It gets the same thing as escape rooms. It's an experience that requires a lot of detail, a lot of creativity. I've seen ads for writers pay up to $70,000 a year to help create these worlds, and I think that's something that's going to continue to grow.
That escape room is a good. I agree with you. That is something I thought about with this. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's good because it's actually interactive and engaging the brains of consumers as opposed to just sedentary entertainment.
Yep.
My master's work was on. It basically involved a lot of discussions with people who live a lot of or a concerning amount of time in virtual worlds, not necessarily VR, but in open world games or like the classic Second Life type environment, in order to supplement or discover themselves. I'm thinking that the technology that we're talking about with VR, has existed for a while in terms of taking people to a place digitally, that San Junipero concept from Black Mirror, where you are allowed to explore yourself within a safe environment. And I think as we get through to the end of this pandemic, we're going to see a lot of people who are still kind of clinging to that virtual world where they can explore aspects of themselves in their life that they wouldn't in the meatverse. So
right.
I think those technologies and those experiences are going to grow in the next 10 years.
Right.
I definitely agree with the mail in or the mailed, mystery boxes, because I've seen a lot of our friends get those, over the course of, these, well, near 12 months now that, we've been living this current normal. And it's always interesting to see how well those, truncated stories are. It's my understanding, it's each box is its own take. Although I think there is a couple of them where it's an ongoing thing, but you can like bow out at any time. The nature of subscription boxes, as it were. Uh, Something that I think may be on the horizon, and I know, you touched on it about the virtual reality. I agree. We've been told virtual reality is just around the corner. It's just around the corner. And it's like 3D films. I don't think it'll ever truly be what people want it to be. Like everybody expects, oh, VR, it's going to be like the holodeck from Star Trek. As nice as that would be, as cool as it would be, I think that's something that sadly I don't know we'll ever experience in our lifetimes. But I think a stepping stone to that would be an interactive story. Like I'm sure we all remember the choose your own adventure books.
Mm.
Well,
Yep.
something that I think would be interesting, and I know there are a couple, I can't think of the darn name of them, but there's stories that interact with your phone. You scan a QR code, or
Yep.
it has an app that's specifically designed to go with it, where depending on how you interact with the two, you'll get additional information on your phone or tablet or email, or different formats of giving you that full immersion experience without the price tag of necessarily a subscription box, or in some instances, fancy schmancy equipment like a video game console or a computer. I remember back in, I want to say either the late 90s or early 2000s, there was a conspiracy theory type immersive experience. I think it was called like the Majestic 12 project or something like that. It was a take on the Majestic 12 conspiracy. And it was a thing where you had a computer disk that you play on your computer, and at certain spots it would flash a phone number that was dedicated to the company that manufactured it, and you'd call the number and you'd get, you know you'd overhear like a mission report, or a conference call or something, and information in that you were supposed to pull out and use in the virtual experience on your computer. So I think something like that, with the advent of the technology that we have now, thanks to Zoom and Discord, GatherTown, I think is something that's relatively new. Something like that, I think we could see a resurgence of that, you know, next tier immersion into the story.
Yeah, it's very smart. I think one of the things that I think is interesting is uh, how much the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because I remember playing, there's an old 80s thing called Murder to Go, which was mystery in a box that you would get and
Okay.
play with your friends. And so it's funny, now we get these, as you say, the subscription thing where people are doing the same thing, which is maybe optimistic to me in the sense that it continues to return us to the sort of core of what makes a good story remains the same, has always remained the same, because it's consumed by the same species. We're all humans producing things for humans, and so
Yeah.
there's only so many kind of emotional conditions and stories and things like that that one can tell. The other thing that I'll add to this is the I think a lot of it too is going to be iterating on existing systems, and I'm particularly interested in the way this takes an existing story that is there and then building and developing it. So to go back to, I've been using, I mean, I do a lot of writing and fiction, so I'm not just doing games, but just the new technology stuff is very much in the game market in my mind anyway. One of the things that I've been doing recently quite a bit on my Twitch channel is a playthrough of the Sorcery series by Steve Jackson. Now, these are the best game books that were ever written back in the early 80s. And this is Steve Jackson from Games Workshop fame that eventually went on to do Warhammer and all that kind of stuff. And they were gorgeous, like beautifully illustrated, like really striking stuff. And I got my first one of them at a Caldors, like for $3, right? And now a company called Inkle in the last few years put together a full video game version of these, but explodes what they are, right? So they are their own thing, and there's a plot line that was followed, but goes in wildly different directions. And each book that they put into a digital format gets more and more ambitious and adds time traveling mechanics and systems that never existed in the original books, and in each of these cases makes them better. And I think the reason that it makes them better, and that's saying a lot for a game book that is still great and holds up, what makes it better is the fact that they take the core of the adventure the player was on, of the emotional beats that they followed, of the characters that they met, of the things that they, and at the time in the early 80s, stuff that you did in book 1 affecting stuff in book 4, that was heady stuff for 83, 84, 85. And the fact that they take that idea and develop it so that other characters that are just bit players become hugely important. Aspects of how you interact with a couple of throwaway sentences in the book become an entire side quest, its own thing that is sort of developed within the context of this video game, is fascinating to me. And it's both building on the core of a good story and a good game experience and making it into something, because of the technology we have, something which is wholly new. And I think that to me, and my more optimistic moments, that I think is a good sign, because it means we're going to continue to go back to those story concepts that matter, but we're also at the same time going to be able to do them in ways we would not have expected otherwise. And that to me is pretty awesome, I think. It's a good time to be alive. All right. But I know everyone's like, what now? Like, it is, once we get through the pandemic, I swear. All right. We have about 2 minutes left, so that gives us a chance to let each of the panelists have one final comment and basically tell us where we can find you here on the internet and elsewhere. And if you also wouldn't mind typing that in your Zoom chat if you can, so people can see that, that would be good. So I'll go in the other direction. Nathan, I'll start with you. Anything of yours you want to talk about specifically that you want to pitch, and or any last thoughts about this?
Just a quick plug of the 3 current things that people can check out, because Dark Operations is temporarily on hold because of pandemic. It makes doing reshoots and meetings kind of limited. But if you folks want to catch the projects that I'm active in, we've got the Never Gets Old podcast, the MacGyver podcast, and Studying Scarlet. Those are available on anywhere that you can download podcasts to listen with your ears, or any other items that you decide to listen with. Facebook pages are titled as respectively, and the Twitter and Instagram titles are the same, or handles are all the same. Studying Scarlet Pod, MacGyver podcast, and Never Gets Old podcast. And afterwards, if anybody has any questions, they can reach me through the Discord channel for Farpoint.
Very cool. Thank you, Nathan. And Jay?
Thanks everybody for coming out. You can find about 10 years worth of stuff on my website, jsmithaudio.com. Most of the stuff there is free. I appreciate you taking a look at some of the fiction that I've written. I think the latest thing I've put out is a novel called The Resurrection Pact, which deals with people who live their best lives or their preferred lives inside a virtual world, and the consequences of that on their real lives. So there are sample chapters you can check out. I think we are the greatest period for storytelling yet. There's so many different ways now that we can tell the stories we want to tell. We just have to figure out the best way to do it. Technology that exists allow you to overcome your own limitations in terms of grammar and vocabulary, and even structure of storytelling exists that can help you be the best storyteller and tell your story. So tell good stories and make good art.
I agree with all of that. I apologize, Charles Chaplin. We didn't get to your question about the dividing line between an interactive story and a game because it came later on. But again, you can find us hopefully in that Discord place. Also, I will be doing a talk on story building for dungeon mastering and writing, and how those things kind of tie into each other at 1 o'clock. Thank you to Robert from Farpoint Tech for handling this for us. And thank you to our panelists, Nathan and Jay. And thanks, attendees. This was fun. We will see you down the road.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This was a good experience.
Thank you, guys. Very much so.
Guys.
Appreciate
and
that.
hopefully we can all meet up physically next year.
In person next year. Boy, I hope so.
So everybody stay safe, and depending on where you're at, stay warm.
Same to you. Thanks, Nathan. Thank you, Jay. And thanks again, Robert.
Thank you again, Robert. Yes. All right, let's see here. Oh, there it is.